That tattoo, you don't earn something like that twice. The voice came sharp and careless, cutting through the dry afternoon air like gravel under boots, and a few scattered laughs followed as a group of young recruits leaned against the chain-link fence bordering the training yard, their uniforms crisp, their confidence louder than the distant hum of helicopters circling somewhere beyond the base perimeter. Arthur Hayes didn't look up at first, standing near the shade of a maintenance shed with his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture relaxed but grounded, as if the earth beneath his boots belonged to him in a way no one else could understand. The sun catching the faint lines on his forearm where faded ink curved across weathered skin, a tattoo so worn it looked more like a shadow than a symbol. "Hey, old man," Logan Price called out, stepping closer with the easy swagger of someone who had never been tested beyond a controlled environment. "That's some kind of vintage souvenir? Or you just like playing dress-up?" More laughter rippled through the group, quick and eager, the kind that fed on itself, while Ethan Cole circled slightly to the side, squinting at the design as if trying to decode something he didn't quite believe was real. And Arthur finally lifted his gaze, pale blue eyes steady and unreadable, not challenging, not defensive, just present. The recruits expected something, an excuse, a denial, maybe even irritation. But what they got instead was silence, and it unsettled them more than they cared to admit, because silence didn't give them anything to push against. "I've seen every SEAL insignia there is," Logan continued, folding his arms as he leaned in closer, his shadow stretching across the cracked concrete between them. "And that right there? That's not regulation, which means one thing. Fake." He said it louder this time, making sure the others heard, making sure the moment grew, and Ethan chuckled as he stepped forward, pulling out his phone with a casual flick of his wrist. "Hold still. I gotta get a picture of this," he said, angling the camera toward Arthur's arm. "Might as well document the world's worst attempt at stolen valor." And the word hung there for a second, heavier than the rest. But Arthur didn't move, didn't pull away, didn't even glance at the device. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, just enough that the light caught the tattoo differently, revealing its shape in fragments. A circle that wasn't perfect, a line that seemed deliberately broken, a mark that felt less like decoration and more like a memory that refused to fade. "You ever think," Arthur said quietly, his voice low and even, carrying just enough to reach them without effort, "that maybe not everything is meant to be recognized?" The recruits exchanged glances, the tone catching them off guard, not because it was aggressive, but because it wasn't, and Logan scoffed, waving a dismissive hand as if brushing the moment aside. "Yeah, or maybe it's just not real," he shot back, stepping closer until he was within arm's reach, his confidence pressing forward like a physical force. "Because out here, if it's not real, it doesn't matter." And for a brief second, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant clang of metal from the far end of the yard, a hollow, rhythmic sound that echoed against the buildings, and Arthur's eyes flickered, not toward the recruits, but somewhere past them, as if the sound had unlocked something buried deep beneath years of quiet. Ethan leaned in then, closer than before, his phone lowering as curiosity replaced mockery, his fingers hovering just inches from the faded ink. "So what is it then?" he asked, softer now, almost involuntary, and without waiting for an answer, he reached out, his fingertips brushing lightly against the edge of the tattoo, and in that instant, something changed, not in the air, not in the sound, but in the weight of the moment itself, as if the ground had shifted beneath them in a way none of them could yet see. And Arthur didn't pull back, didn't react outwardly, but the stillness around him deepened, solidified, becoming something far heavier than before, something that made even the laughter die out just a fraction too quickly, leaving behind a silence that no one seemed willing to break first. The contact should have meant nothing, just skin against skin for less than a second, but Ethan felt it immediately, a strange, almost electric stillness that traveled up his fingers and settled somewhere behind his ribs. Not pain, not fear, just something he could not name, and he pulled his hand back instinctively, glancing at Logan as if expecting a reaction, but Logan only smirked, misreading the moment entirely. "What? Did it bite you?" he said with a short laugh, trying to pull the energy back into something familiar, something controllable, yet the air did not return to what it had been. the easy arrogance now thinning at the edges, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. Arthur remained exactly where he stood, his arm lowering slowly back to his side, the faded lines of the tattoo disappearing again into shadow, but his gaze had shifted, no longer on the recruits, no longer even on the yard. It seemed fixed somewhere, far beyond the perimeter, somewhere none of them could follow. And for a moment, no one spoke, the distant hum of rotor blades growing louder, then softer again as the wind carried it away, leaving behind the faint metallic rattle of a loose panel on the shed behind them. Petty Officer Daniel Brooks had been watching from across the yard the entire time, leaning against a stack of equipment crates with his arms folded, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. He had seen this kind of interaction before, young men testing boundaries, pushing against what they did not understand. But something about this one had caught his attention early, something in the way the old man had not reacted, not even slightly. And when Ethan reached out, Brooks had straightened just a fraction, his instincts tightening like a drawn line, because he had seen that look before, not on a training field, but in places where silence carried more weight than orders. He stepped closer now, slow enough not to draw attention, but deliberate enough to close the distance, his eyes settling briefly on Arthur's arm as the light shifted again, and for just a second, the pattern aligned clearly in his view, not enough to fully understand it, but enough to trigger a memory, a fragment of something he had seen once, buried in a briefing file he had not been meant to study for long, a symbol that had been described not with details, but with a warning, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "All right, that is enough," Brooks said finally, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the lingering tension without raising it, and the recruits turned toward him, some with relief, others with mild annoyance, Logan straightening slightly, as if preparing to justify himself. "We were just," he began, but Brooks lifted a hand, stopping him without effort. "I know exactly what you were doing," he said, his tone even, not angry, not confrontational, just final, and something in it made Logan close his mouth before the sentence could finish. Brooks shifted his weight, his gaze moving from one recruit to another before settling briefly on Arthur, and in that glance, there was something different, not recognition, not yet, but respect forming at the edges, cautious and incomplete, like a thought still assembling itself. "You think you understand what matters out here," he continued, looking back at the group, "because you have the uniform, the training schedule, the checklists, but there are things you do not see on paper." And he let the words hang there for a second, not as a lecture, but as a boundary. Ethan swallowed slightly, glancing again at Arthur's arm, the image of the tattoo now sharper in his mind than before, and the unease returned, stronger this time, not from what he knew, but from what he did not, and Brooks noticed it, the shift, the hesitation, and it confirmed what he was beginning to suspect, that this was not just an old man with a story, not just a relic passing through. This was something else entirely, something that had been placed deliberately outside of recognition. Without another word, Brooks reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around his phone, his movements subtle, almost routine, but his mind was already moving faster, connecting fragments, recalling that file, that symbol, the way it had been flagged, the way the instructor had paused before moving on, as if even mentioning it had crossed a line, and Brooks turned slightly away from the group, just enough to shield the screen as he scrolled, searching for a number he had not used in months, one that bypassed the usual chain, one that would not ask unnecessary questions. Behind him, the recruits stood quieter now, their earlier confidence settling into something more cautious, while Arthur remained still, unchanged, as if none of it required his involvement, as if whatever was coming had already been set in motion long before any of them had stepped onto that yard. Brooks stepped farther away from the group, the crunch of gravel under his boots soft but deliberate, each step creating just enough distance to turn his next action into something private, controlled, and the moment his thumb pressed against the screen, the world around him seemed to narrow, the noise of the yard fading into a low, distant hum as he brought the phone to his ear, his posture straightening in a way that was not for show, but instinct, muscle memory from years of understanding when something required precision rather than speed. The line rang once, then twice, and when it connected, the voice on the other end was calm, measured, the kind of voice that did not waste time with unnecessary words. "Chief," Brooks said quietly, turning his back fully now, his gaze fixed on the far fence line as if watching something only he could see. "I need you to pull a reference on a symbol." There was a brief pause, not confusion, but calculation. "Go ahead," the voice replied, and Brooks exhaled slowly, choosing his words with care. "Circular mark, incomplete line, central break, looks hand done, aged, not standard issue. I have seen it once before, in a restricted briefing. I need confirmation." The silence that followed was different this time, heavier, stretching just long enough to signal that the description had landed somewhere important. And when the voice returned, it was lower, sharper. "Where are you seeing this?" Brooks did not hesitate. "Training yard, South Maintenance Sector." Another pause, shorter now, tighter, followed by a quiet shift in tone. "Do not engage further. Do not escalate. Stay where you are." The line clicked dead before Brooks could respond, and he lowered the phone slowly, his grip tightening just a fraction as the weight of the exchange settled in. Behind him, the recruits had not moved much, but the energy had changed, their earlier laughter replaced by a restless stillness. Logan, shifting his stance, crossing and uncrossing his arms as if trying to reclaim the control he felt slipping away. "What was that about?" he asked, his voice lighter than before, forced into casual, but it did not land the same way. Not anymore. And Ethan remained quiet, his eyes drifting again to Arthur, then back to the ground, then back again, caught in a loop he could not break, because the image in his mind refused to settle into something simple. Arthur, for his part, had not moved at all, his presence unchanged, as if the conversation, the call, the subtle shift in authority around him had nothing to do with him. His gaze still fixed somewhere beyond the visible world. And yet there was something different now, something heavier in the way the air seemed to settle around him, like gravity had increased by just enough to be felt, but not explained. Brooks turned back toward the group, his expression controlled, but his eyes sharper now, more focused, and he studied Arthur for a second longer than necessary, not searching for answers, but confirming what he already suspected, that whatever this was, it was far beyond the level of a training yard interaction, far beyond the authority of a few recruits testing boundaries. And he stepped closer again, closing the distance with measured calm. "You are going to step back," he said, not raising his voice, but leaving no space for argument. And this time, they listened, not because of rank, but because something in the situation had shifted into a space they did not understand. The wind picked up briefly, carrying the distant thump of rotor blades again. Louder now, more defined, and Brooks glanced toward the sky without turning his head fully, just enough to register the change, because he knew that kind of sound, knew the rhythm of incoming movement that was not part of the normal pattern, and his jaw tightened slightly as the realization settled in that the call had not just been acknowledged, it had been acted on. Logan followed his gaze, squinting against the sunlight. "That for us?" he asked with a half-smile that did not quite reach his eyes. But Brooks did not answer, because he did not need to, because whatever was coming was not for them to question. And as the sound grew closer, filling the space above the yard with a steady, controlled presence, the recruits felt it too, the subtle shift from routine to something else entirely, something that did not belong to their schedule or their understanding. And Arthur Hayes, standing in the same place he had been since the beginning, finally blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging a moment that had been inevitable all along. The sound did not arrive all at once. It built itself piece by piece, a distant rhythm at first, low and steady, then gradually sharper, more defined, until it settled into a presence that could not be ignored, the unmistakable cadence of rotor blades cutting through warm afternoon air, and every head in the yard tilted upward almost in unison, not out of curiosity, but instinct, because this was not scheduled, not listed on any board or timeline, and that alone made it different. Dust began to stir along the edges of the training yard, lifting in thin spirals that danced across the cracked concrete and gravel, tugging at loose fabric, whispering against metal surfaces, and Brooks remained still, his posture squared, his eyes tracking the approach with quiet certainty, while Logan took a step back without realizing it, his earlier confidence now thinning into something less stable, That is not part of drills, he muttered, half to himself, and Ethan said nothing, his gaze locked on the sky, his chest rising just a little slower, a little deeper, as if his body was trying to understand something his mind had not caught up to yet. The helicopter came into view beyond the perimeter fencing, dark against the pale sky, its movement controlled, deliberate, not rushed, not dramatic, just precise. And as it lowered toward a landing zone just beyond the training yard, the wind it carried rolled across the ground in waves, flattening loose grass, rattling the chain-link fence, pushing sound and air into every corner of the space. And still, Arthur Hayes did not move, his stance unchanged, his expression calm, as if this arrival had nothing to do with him, and yet everything at the same time. Brooks exhaled slowly through his nose, the confirmation settling in fully now, and he shifted his weight just enough to anchor himself, because whatever was about to happen was no longer within the boundaries of routine command. It had stepped into a different layer entirely, one that did not announce itself with orders, but with presence. The helicopter touched down with a controlled finality, the skids meeting ground with a muted firmness that carried through the soles of every boot in the yard. And for a moment, nothing else happened. The rotors still spinning, the air still moving, the sound still heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then the side door opened. A figure stepped out, not hurried, not theatrical, but with a kind of quiet authority that did not need introduction. Boots hitting the ground with measured intent, posture straight, gaze forward, and even from a distance, there was something unmistakable about the way he moved, something that carried weight without force, command without noise, and Brooks felt it immediately, a recognition not of the man's face, but of what he represented. The recruits shifted again, their earlier energy now fully replaced by something else, something closer to awareness, though none of them would have called it that. Logan straightening instinctively, adjusting his stance as if preparing for inspection, while Ethan's eyes flicked briefly toward Arthur, then back toward the approaching figure, caught between 2 points he did not yet know how to connect. The man walked forward across the yard, each step even, unhurried, closing the distance not as someone responding to a situation, but as someone who already understood it. And as he moved closer, the details sharpened, the insignia, the bearing, the subtle signals that spoke louder than any introduction ever could. And Brooks felt his shoulders tighten just slightly before settling, his body aligning without conscious thought, because this was not a moment to interpret, it was a moment to recognize. The wind began to settle as the rotor's speed decreased, the noise lowering just enough to allow the space to breathe again. And in that returning quiet, the distance between the man and Arthur Hayes closed to just a few yards. And for the first time since the helicopter had appeared, Arthur shifted his gaze, lifting it from that distant, unseen horizon to meet what stood before him, not with surprise, not with tension, but with the same steady calm he had carried from the beginning, as if this meeting had been written long before any of them had arrived. And the recruits, standing just off to the side, felt it without understanding it, the moment stretching, deepening, becoming something heavier than anything they had experienced in training, something that did not belong to drills or ranks or schedules, but to something far older, far quieter, and far more absolute. The man stopped just short of Arthur Hayes, close enough that the distance between them no longer felt like space, but like a line drawn with intention, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the air settling into a stillness that pressed gently against everything around it. As if even the wind had chosen to step aside, Brooks straightened instinctively, his heels grounding against the concrete with quiet precision, while the recruits froze in place, their earlier movement replaced by something far more rigid, something closer to awareness than discipline, because this was no longer about instruction, this was about presence. The man's gaze lowered slightly, not scanning, not questioning, but focusing, drawn to Arthur's forearm where the faded tattoo rested like a whisper of something older than any of them. And as the light shifted across it again, the line seemed to align just enough, the broken circle, the deliberate imperfection, the mark that had once meant something to a very specific few. There was no confusion in the man's expression, no hesitation, only recognition, immediate and absolute. And it showed not in his face, but in the way his posture adjusted by the smallest degree, a subtle shift that carried more meaning than any spoken confirmation. Logan felt it before he understood it. The way the atmosphere changed, tightening and deepening at the same time. And he swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry, his earlier words replaying in his mind, with a weight they had not carried before. While Ethan's eyes locked onto the tattoo again, his earlier curiosity now replaced by something closer to realization, though he still could not define it. The man took one final step forward, closing the last inches between them, and for a heartbeat, the entire yard seemed to pause, the distant rotor slowing, the faint rattle of metal settling into silence. And Arthur Hayes lifted his chin just slightly, meeting the man's gaze fully for the first time, not as someone being addressed, but as someone who had already been acknowledged. No words were exchanged, none were needed, because whatever passed between them did not belong to language. It belonged to something carried, something remembered, something that existed long before this moment and would continue long after it. Brooks felt the shift hit him fully then, a quiet certainty locking into place, and he exhaled slowly, the last piece of doubt leaving him, because this was not a coincidence, not a misunderstanding. This was confirmation. The man's hand moved then, not quickly, not dramatically, but with deliberate control, rising from his side in a motion so precise it seemed almost ceremonial. And as it reached the edge of his sleeve, he paused for the briefest fraction of a second, as if marking the moment, before pulling the fabric back just enough to reveal his own forearm. The recruits leaned forward, without meaning to, drawn in by something they could not resist, and there it was, not identical in wear, not aged in the same way, but unmistakably the same symbol, the same broken circle, the same deliberate mark that did not exist in any manual they had ever studied. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers, first confusion, then recognition, then something heavier that settled deep in their chests, and Logan's shoulders dropped just slightly, the tension leaving them as his understanding caught up to the moment, while Ethan's breath slowed, his earlier unease resolving into a quiet, undeniable clarity. The man let the sleeve fall back into place, covering the tattoo once more, but the image remained, fixed in the minds of everyone present, and without breaking eye contact, without shifting his stance, he completed the motion that had already begun, his hand rising the final inches into a crisp, controlled salute, not exaggerated, not performative, but exact, the kind of salute that carried weight because it was given, not required. The silence that followed was complete, absolute, not empty but full, filled with the kind of understanding that did not need explanation. And in that silence, the hierarchy of the yard shifted without a single word being spoken, the recruits standing still, not because they were told to, but because they no longer had any place to move. And Arthur Hayes, standing as he always had, returned the gaze with the same quiet steadiness, the moment settling around him like something that had finally come home. No one moved after the salute, not because they had been ordered to remain still, but because movement itself suddenly felt inappropriate, as if it would break something that could not be repaired once disturbed, and the recruits stood frozen in that realization, their earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet, pressing awareness that they had stepped into a moment far beyond their understanding. Logan felt his chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of recognition settling into place, the pieces aligning in a way he could no longer ignore, and he glanced toward Ethan, searching for confirmation. But Ethan was already staring straight ahead, his posture unconsciously correcting, his shoulders squared, his hands steady at his sides, as if his body had chosen to respond before his mind could catch up. Brooks remained exactly where he was, his stance firm, his gaze forward, but inside, the tension that had built earlier was now gone, replaced by a calm certainty, the kind that came when something hidden was finally revealed. And he understood now why the file had been restricted, why the symbol had been mentioned only once and never explained, because some things were not meant to be taught, only recognized. The man who had arrived held the salute for a moment longer than necessary by standard protocol, not out of formality, but out of respect, and when his hand lowered, it did so with the same measured control, returning to his side without haste, his posture unchanged, his presence still carrying the same quiet authority, but now it was different. Now it was grounded in something visible, something undeniable. Arthur Hayes did not return the salute in the same formal way. He did not need to. Instead, he gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible, but it carried a weight that none of the recruits could fully comprehend. And in that small motion, there was acknowledgement, not of rank, but of shared history, of something that existed outside the structure they had been trained to follow. The wind had settled completely now, the rotor blades slowing to a low, steady hum, and the training yard felt different, as if the space itself had shifted into a quieter state, one that demanded attention rather than noise. And for the first time since the moment began, the recruits understood that they were no longer participants, they were witnesses. Logan swallowed again, his earlier words echoing in his mind with a clarity that made them impossible to dismiss, and he felt the urge to speak, to correct, to explain, but no words came, because nothing he could say would fit into what this moment had become. And beside him, Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, not out of shame alone, but out of recognition, the kind that settled deep and stayed there. Brooks finally took a step forward, not to interrupt, not to assert control, but to align himself with what had already been established, and he stopped just short of the two men, his posture straight, his expression composed, waiting, because he understood that whatever came next would not be directed at him, but he was still part of the space it occupied. The man's eyes shifted briefly toward Brooks, a quick acknowledgement, then back to Arthur, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying just enough to be heard without breaking the stillness. "It has been a long time," he said, the words simple, but layered with something deeper, something that did not need explanation, and Arthur's gaze held steady, his expression unchanged. "Long enough," he replied, his voice just as quiet, just as controlled, and the exchange, brief as it was, carried more weight than anything the recruits had said combined. The silence returned immediately after, but it was no longer uncertain. It was complete, grounded, and in that silence, the recruits understood something they had not been taught. That respect was not given because of visible symbols or loud declarations. It was given because of what those symbols meant to those who could truly see them. And as they stood there, still and quiet, the lesson settled into place without a single command being issued. The words faded into the air and left behind something heavier than silence, something that settled into the space between everyone present. And for a moment, time itself seemed to slow, stretching just enough for every detail to become sharper, clearer, more permanent. And the recruits stood in that space without knowing where to place themselves, their earlier certainty gone, replaced by a quiet recalibration happening beneath the surface. Logan shifted his weight again, but this time it was controlled, deliberate, his posture straightening not out of habit, but out of understanding, and his eyes lowered briefly before returning forward, not to challenge, but to acknowledge, while Ethan inhaled slowly, steadying himself, the tension in his shoulders easing into something more grounded, something that resembled respect rather than reaction. Brooks remained still, but his presence had changed as well, no longer simply observing, now fully aligned with the gravity of the moment, and he allowed his gaze to move once more toward the recruits, not with correction, not with authority, but with a quiet expectation that needed no words, and they felt it, each of them adjusting in small ways that would have gone unnoticed in any other situation. But here, now, they carried meaning. The man who had arrived let his eyes move briefly across the group, not scanning, not evaluating, but acknowledging. A subtle recognition of the shift that had taken place, and when his gaze returned to Arthur Hayes, there was a faint change, almost imperceptible, as if something long held had finally settled into place. "They are learning," he said quietly, not as a statement, but as an observation, and Arthur's expression did not change, but there was the slightest narrowing of his eyes, not in judgment, but in agreement. "They are watching," Arthur replied, his voice calm, measured, and the distinction hung there for a second, subtle but clear, and Brooks caught it immediately, understanding that watching was not the same as learning. Not yet. The recruits heard it too, even if they could not fully articulate it, and the words settled differently than anything they had been told before, because they were not instructions, they were reflections, And reflections required something more than obedience. They required awareness. The wind moved lightly across the yard again, softer now, carrying the last fading echoes of the helicopter as the rotor slowed. Further, and the world seemed to return in small pieces, the distant clang of equipment, the faint hum of activity beyond the fence, but none of it broke the moment. It simply framed it, giving it shape without diminishing its weight. Logan finally spoke, but his voice was different now, lower, more controlled. "Sir," he began, the word chosen carefully, not out of rank recognition, but out of respect that had formed in real time. "We did not know." And he stopped there, because anything beyond that would have sounded like an excuse, and he understood, perhaps for the first time, that this was not a moment for explanation. It was a moment for acknowledgement. Arthur's gaze shifted toward him then, steady and direct, and for a brief second, Logan felt as if he were being seen in a way that went beyond surface, beyond uniform, beyond words. And it was not uncomfortable, but it was undeniable. And Arthur gave a slight nod, not forgiving, not dismissing, simply accepting the statement for what it was. Ethan followed a moment later, his voice quieter. "We should have looked closer," he said, the words simple, but carrying a weight that had not been there before, and Brooks felt a small shift inside, a recognition that something had changed, not completely, not instantly, but enough to matter. The man who had arrived said nothing more, because nothing more was needed, and he turned slightly, not away from Arthur, but enough to signal that the moment had reached its natural end. And yet it did not feel like an ending. It felt like something that would remain, something that would stay with each of them long after the yard returned to its normal rhythm. And Arthur Hayes, standing where he had always been, allowed his gaze to lift once more toward that distant point beyond the visible world, as if the past and the present had briefly aligned, and now, once again, had settled back into their quiet, enduring balance. The shift did not end when the word stopped. It lingered, settled into the ground beneath their boots and into the air they were breathing. And for the first time since the moment began, the training yard felt smaller, not in size, but in importance, as if something far larger had briefly stepped into it and now refused to fully leave. The man who had arrived took a slow step back, not in retreat, but in closure, the kind of movement that marked the end of something that did not need to be repeated, and his gaze moved once more across the recruits, not searching, not judging, but confirming what had already changed, and they felt it, each of them standing a little straighter, not out of habit, but out of understanding that this was no longer about them. It never had been. Brooks let out a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding, the tension fully gone now, replaced by a steady clarity, and he shifted slightly to the side, giving space not because it was required, but because it felt right, because the moment demanded it. The rotor behind them slowed further, the sound lowering into a steady hum that blended into the background, and the wind softened with it, leaving the yard in a calm that felt almost deliberate, as if everything had aligned just long enough for this to happen and was now returning to its place. Arthur Hayes remained where he was, unchanged, his posture relaxed but grounded, his presence no less steady than before, but there was something different in the way the space acknowledged him now. Something that had not been there when the recruits first approached him. Something that could not be undone. Logan glanced toward Ethan again, but this time there was no confusion. Brushing across the yard, tugging at fabric and dust, and then it was gone, leaving behind a space that looked the same, sounded the same, but felt entirely different, as if something invisible had been placed there, something that would remain long after everyone had walked away. The sound of the helicopter faded into the distance until it became nothing more than a low echo swallowed by the sky. And when it was finally gone, the silence it left behind did not feel empty. It felt full, as if something had been placed into the space that could not be seen, but could not be ignored either. And the training yard, once loud with movement and voices, now held a stillness that demanded attention rather than action. The recruits remained where they stood for a moment longer. Not because they had been told to stay, but because stepping away felt like leaving something unfinished, and Logan finally shifted, slow and deliberate, his boots scraping lightly against the concrete as he turned toward Arthur Hayes, not with the careless confidence he had carried before, but with a quiet respect that had settled deep enough to hold. Ethan followed, his movements measured, his gaze steady, and neither of them spoke at first, because words no longer came easily, not after what they had just witnessed. And when Logan finally did speak, his voice was low, controlled. "Sir," he said again. But this time the word carried no uncertainty, no hesitation, only acknowledgement. "We understand now." And it was not a statement of knowledge, but of change. Arthur looked at them for a moment, his pale blue eyes steady as always, and there was no judgment there, no approval either, just a quiet recognition that they had reached a point where something had shifted, and he gave a small nod, the same simple motion that had carried so much weight before, and that was all he offered, because it was all that was needed. Brooks watched from a few steps away, his posture relaxed now, his arms no longer folded, and there was a faint sense of satisfaction in his expression, not pride, not relief, but something quieter, the kind that came from seeing a lesson land exactly where it needed to without being forced. And he stepped forward just enough to close the distance, his voice calm as he spoke. "Remember this," he said, not as an order, but as something meant to stay with them. "Not everything that matters is written where you can read it." And Logan nodded once, slowly, the words settling into place with a weight that would not fade quickly. Ethan glanced once more at Arthur's forearm, but this time there was no curiosity in his gaze, no attempt to decode or question, only recognition. And he understood now that the symbol was not meant to be explained, it was meant to be carried, and that understanding alone was enough. The yard began to return in small ways, distant voices picking up again, the faint clang of equipment resuming, the ordinary rhythm of the bass slipping back into place, but it did not erase what had happened, it only moved around it, leaving it intact beneath the surface. Arthur shifted his weight slightly, the first real movement he had made in some time, and he turned toward the edge of the yard, his steps unhurried, his posture unchanged, as if he were simply continuing something that had never truly been interrupted. And as he passed by the recruits, neither Logan nor Ethan moved to stop him. Neither spoke, they simply stood there, watching, not because they needed to see more, but because they understood enough. Brooks gave a small nod as Arthur passed him. A gesture returned just as quietly, and then Arthur continued on, moving toward the far side of the yard where the noise softened and the space opened up, his figure gradually blending into the ordinary background of the bass, no longer the center of attention, but no less significant. Logan exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling into a new kind of steadiness, and he glanced at Ethan once more, but this time there was no question in it, only agreement, and Ethan nodded in return, both of them standing a little differently than they had before, not because they had been told to change, but because they had seen something that made change unavoidable. Brooks turned slightly, his gaze following Arthur for a moment longer before returning to the recruits, and there was nothing more to say, nothing more to add, because the lesson had already been given in the only way that truly mattered. The yard moved on, the day continued, but something remained beneath it all, something quiet and enduring, a reminder. That respect was not something demanded in the moment. It was something earned long before and carried long after. And as the recruits finally turned back toward their duties, that understanding stayed with them, steady and unspoken, like a mark that did not need to be seen to be real.